Hi, I'm Dylan Frew, and today I'd like to talk to you about evil. This is my copy of Jeff Smith's Bone. Now this is one of my favorite pieces of work ever, and I've recently reread this bad boy, all 1,300 pages of this deluxe edition. And something kind of struck me. There is this trope in classic fantasy of structuring the hierarchies of your villains. And if you've ever DM'd D&D or played it, you're probably familiar with this. It's a very easy way to build your villains on top of each other, continually ramping up the power and danger of each of them, as well as making the big bad much more interesting because there are so many different layers going underneath and around it. Today I'd like to just kind of explain this and give you a few examples from some of my favorites. So I think we'll start with a tried and true classic, Lord of the Rings. Everyone knows it, and it's probably the best way to explain it. This is arguably one of the first uses of this trope in fantasy, and like a lot of high fantasy, almost everything is taken from Lord of the Rings. There are going to be brief spoilers ahead, so for anyone who doesn't know, Sauron is the big bad of Lord of the Rings. He's not quite the devil equivalent, but he is a bad guy that wants power and seeks a lot of it. That is why he forges the One Ring. His evil and power naturally draw underlings to him, and so that's kind of how we build the structure. So let's kind of build up. The common cannon fodder villains of Lord of the Rings are very much the orcs. These are mindless warriors, and they just kind of follow Sauron's rule. They're the soldiers in the battle, essentially, and that's the bottom tier of the hierarchy. Now, if we go up a little bit, we could say the next tier is Saruman. Now, Saruman is a wizard, so he is much more powerful than the rest, and for most of the Lord of the Rings, he is the one arguably controlling the army of orcs, but he himself is again at the command of Sauron, which is what makes him not a top tier villain. Sauron is clearly a lot more powerful than the orcs and the armies he controls, and he also has a more personal connection to the heroes rather than these mindless hordes of what are essentially just soldiers. And that's the other reason he kind of makes it up a tier. Now the next level, I would say, are the Nazguls or the Ringwraiths. Now these are essentially the straight foot soldiers of Sauron. The orcs kind of indirectly follow. These guys are, you know, the top paid bills people. They work directly under him. They work with the face and the eye of Sauron. And then controlling them, arguably on the same tier, but maybe one higher, is the Witch King. He is the leader of the Nazguls, and he's pretty much the top of the food chain aside from Sauron himself. Then, of course, we finally hit the big bad. It's Sauron, it's the eye, it's the mouth, far behind the gates of Mordor. However, Lord of the Rings also invented another trope to this hierarchy that shows up a lot in other fantasy books, which is this idea of tangential villains. These are villains that don't really fit into the hierarchy, but still oppose the party or hero of this story. Now, in Tolkien's story, these are the men of Dunharrow, as well as Shelob. You know, these are villains standing in the way of our fellowship's progress, but not necessarily working for Sauron, not necessarily part of the hierarchy. The army of the dead were originally against Sauron, and then they kind of worship him and get exiled. But then they do end up joining for the Siege of Mordor at the end, or helping in the battle. As for Shelob, the only reason she's a villain is her proximity. She's close to Mount Doom and she blocks the heroes, and that's essentially it. With a more universal example out of the way, I'd like to jump to what I really want to talk about, which are probably my two favorite hierarchies in fantasy, and that's going to be Wheel of Time and Bone. Now, I was forced to read Wheel of Time a number of years ago by Colin, And I'm grateful for that because, you know, Wheel of Time is a lot more, it's different than Lord of the Rings. I won't say it's a lot more anything. Lord of the Rings is classic high fantasy. It set the standard for everyone. Wheel of Time is a lot more about politics and countries and peoples and cultures and how they interact in this world. It's about, you know, political structures. So understandably, the structures for the villains are a lot more complicated. Now, there are going to be spoilers here. I'm going to try and kind of go through the books and point out the hierarchies that are at work, starting with, of course, Eye of the World. Now, the Eye of the World, the first book immediately introduces our cannon fodder. After the prologue sets up a villain that we'll get to, actually a couple, the Trollocs attack the village with Rand and Matt and Perrin. And Trollocs are our analogy for orcs in this case. They are the same kind of dumb, just following orders soldier types. And we're introduced to the other shadow spawn, which is the Myrddraal. They're kind of in the orc spot. They're probably a little higher because they're more like generals in the army rather than just the straight soldiers. And then there's also a pseudo tangential villain introduced when Moiraine arrives, because the Aes Sedai are attempting to still men who can channel. Obviously, Moiraine is not a villain, but the Aes Sedai throughout the story will largely be kind of villainous, especially the Tarvalin White Tower ones. And although there is a bit of a stretch, since Moiraine, Nynaeve, Egwene are essentially, you know, some of the main heroes of the story, it's really just the Aes Sedai. And then a little later, when we arrive in Shadar Logoth, we get some pretty interesting things already kind of messing up our tier. We've set up the bottom, and in Shadar Logoth, we get more death, which arguably rivals the Dark One on this tier list. He's supposedly evil incarnate. Shadar Logoth is a very cursed, evil city. But it's kind of hard to put him in here. Anyways, now in the city of Whitebridge, we get another entry into this tier with the Dark Friends. Now, Dark Friends maybe aren't as strong physically as Trollocs or Myrddraal, but they are a little tier higher because they're humans who have chosen to follow evil, which means they can think ahead, they can plan, and it's just, you know, a little more disheartening. Here we get probably the most important Dark Friend in the story, which is Podon Fane. And at this point in the tier, he is low, but we will talk about him again. In the more interesting political structures of Wheel of Time, we get the White Cloaks, who are encountered by Egwene and Perrin. Now, the White Cloaks are interesting because this is an organization that looks to be on the side of good. They are very black and white. They are against the darkness. They are the light. But many times in the story, we see how corrupt their leadership is, and actually they do end up, at least for a little while, becoming a bit of a tangential villain. As we approach the end of the book, it could be argued the Blight itself is kind of a villain, although that's a bit of a stretch. There are, of course, introduced the essentially top, which are the Forsaken. Now, aside from the yet to really be mentioned Dark One, the Forsaken are the top of the barrel. They even share a prison with the Dark One, and we're introduced to our first two Forsaken at the end of this book, who are Agnor and Balthamel. Then we get a bit of an introduction to the Dark One. Put simply, he is the devil, or vaguely Sauron equivalent. He's kind of like a source of evil within the world. But we'll talk about him at the end. Agnor and Balthamel are sent out, and we got some questions to answer. The Great Hunt. Immediately, we get a continuation of these tangential villains. Great Hunt opens with the Amerlin's Seat, Swain, arriving at the city. She is in charge of the Aes Sedai, and she is really not against Rand, but she kind of sets the seeds of the Aes Sedai being against Rand and the party as a whole throughout the story. She's not really evil, but the Aes Sedai definitely get more and more questionable as time goes on, and politically they're always kind of opposing till about the very end. However, in this book, Moraine and the Amerlin are much more on the side of Rand, which giving him the horn and kind of setting the events into motion. We also get the introduction of what are the real antagonists inside the Aes Sedai, and it's actually our next tier, which would be the Black Aja. Now, specifically the one that attacks Rand at the start of this book, but in general, this organization is kind of one more tier up because they can channel, and they are politically very dangerous. Also, Padan Fain is back. You know, we'll talk about him again in a little bit, but Padan Fain does keep showing up throughout the series, and each time he kind of ascends the ladder a little more. Later, when Rand activates the Portal Stone, we finally get to meet Balzamon, or Ishamael, who's essentially the top of our hierarchy. But we'll get into him later. We do meet another Forsaken as well, being Lanfear. When we continue the story of Egwene, Nynaeve, Elaine, and Min, we get introduced to the Seanchan. Now, the Seanchan are some of the best villains in Wheel of Time because they are this gray political spectrum that almost all the books represent. They're not in our hierarchy, but they are definitely tangential villains. The Seanchan are, of course, against channeling, and most of our main characters are skilled in channeling, and so that makes them opposing. And it's really interesting antagonists, because they are very gray. We'll put them in the tangential with the white cloaks there. The rest of the book really focuses on established characters and the army of heroes dissipating, and we move on to the next book, which is Dragon Reborn. Now, in the Dragon Reborn, this is one of the least dense books in the series. It offers one of the most unique ideas within the hierarchy, which we will see pop up time and time again, and that's the idea of Rand himself being a villain. You know, we see this in Lord of the Rings as the ring takes over, say, Bilbo or Frodo. Gollum is kind of in this spectrum, but we never quite see it this way, you know, because in Dragon Reborn, we see Rand start to lose his mind, you know, force people to bow to him, dead people to bow to him, a lot of other kind of bizarre actions. The only other major development in this book before the end comes with the revelation that the Forsaken have taken over Ilion. But, you know, this is also the first mention of the Dark Hounds, which would likely fit almost with Trollocs and Myrddraal, however, probably a little higher because the only really way to kill them is Balefire, which most people would agree is not okay. We also get Morganth, the Queen of Andor's boyfriend, who we'll talk about again later. Finally, we reach the climax of the book, where we get Balal of the Forsaken. Though he's pretty high on the tier, he is very quickly dispatched, just like the end of Eye of the World. Then we get a fight with Ishamael. That's the guy who is very much at the top. He is seemingly defeated. And this is another point where Wheel of Time is a little unique compared to the rest, because even though the Dark One's still out there, it seems like our heroes are unstoppable. You know, Rand has picked up his sword. He's sieged the Stone of Tyr. Ishamael is dead. This is only the third book, and suddenly it seems like we've won. Shadow Rising. This is my personal favorite from the series. Also one I really love. I'd like to make a video about this sometime, but we'll kind of focus on the hierarchy as it is. We get to explore Rand a little more in this book as he pertains to being a villain. A little more as Berelain comes in and, you know, the evil mirror attacks Rand at the start here. This is more hints that the Dark One, because Mat and Perrin also get this bubble of evil, bad mojo. And Elaine and crew give us a little more insight into the Black Aja. We kind of jump forward in this book a lot because it does just use established stuff. Lanfear makes the tier a lot more complicated with her relationship with Lews Therin and then eventually Rand as well. And that kind of makes her near the top tier, but still a little strange. We get big Shadow Spawn deaths, but we've talked about Trollocs and others enough that we can skim over that. The political side of the story comes in again as Rand leaves for the Aiel Waste. The nobles and, you know, the people of Tyr are almost painted as villains. He's very much against them. And they kind of want to keep the people in tier poor, and they are almost tangential villains to our plot. In Tanchico, the Shan-Chan, our good tangential villains, show up again and become even more complicated as a runaway Shan-Chan actually kind of befriends Nynaeve and Elaine, which means once again these villains are about as gray as it gets. We get our first appearance of Mogideon, another top tier Forsaken, like all the Forsaken. And then there's a battle with the Shan-Chan and the Black Aja are kind of represented here in the ranks again. Within the ways, we get another pseudo-tangential villain, Mao Shin. This is another interesting one because it's not a real figure, it's more of a force, like Mordeth is in Shadar Logoth. And it kind of just kills everyone. I think our best comparison between the two would be maybe the Watcher in the Water at the opening of the Mines of Moria here. It's not a villain, it's just something that exists to protect a place, and our heroes want to go to that place. Also, Podon Fane is back. Like I said, every time he shows up, he moves up the hierarchy a little bit. The Wolf Dream provides us with another pseudo-tangential villain, being Slayer, who we'll see pop up a couple of more times before the series is over. And then we get another little fight there. In the Aiel Waste, some of the warriors turn against Rand and start forming their own ranks. This is going to become a pretty big tangential villain. It's when Couladin turns against Rand. He does become Kara Karn. We get Lanfear and Osmodius in the World of Dreams, and this again solidifies them very much in the ranking. Osmodian becomes very interesting because he becomes kind of bound to Rand and is forced to help even though he doesn't want to. And then we get the formation of the Shido, which are probably, aside from Shan-Chan, our biggest tangential villain here. Right at the start of Fires of Heaven, we get another kind of interesting introduction, which is Elida kind of almost making it into the tier. She's not really corrupt enough. Podon Fane shows up, pulls some shenanigans, and again moves up because of his political influence there. And then Ravine finally shows up again, being very much a worm tongue to Queen Trikant. And that makes him a little more interesting. He's kind of playing the political game. In Royan, the Dark Hounds attack, and we get to see why they are a little higher up. They almost kill Matt. Lanfear rats out another Forsaken, again just making her incredibly strange in terms of where her allegiances fall. Speaking of which, Osmodian actually helps out quite a bit. He helps Rand during this time to seal his gateway to Shan-Chan after Aviendha runs away, which makes him a little more complicated, but he's really just saving his own skin. Lanfear is taken out at the end of the book by Moraine. Samael is kind of lurking in the background of the whole book, and then Ravine gets some nasty balefires, so our Forsaken list is slowly being dwindled down as the books go on. Lord of Chaos, our big development in this one is really starting to finally get to see the Dark One. He's stepping out more and more, and we can almost add him to our tier list now. The only reason Nynaeve and crew go to seek the Bowl of the Winds is to fix the weather, which is the Dark One escaping the metaphysical prison at Sheol Ghul. Mazrim Taim turns up in this book and eventually kind of becomes a traitor at the end, putting him in a similar position to Podon Fane. He's a little less black and white in this regard, and it's much more kind of political intrigue. That makes this really interesting, though, because by the end of this book, we very much are in the idea that the Black Tower itself might even be a tangential villain just because of the madness of touching Sayadine. Alana is essentially a pure good character, but her bonding Rand and attempting to control her makes her almost a tangential force here, but she doesn't really intend any harm by it. Samael makes himself even more interesting by making a truce with Rand because he's kind of scared and tries to continue amassing his political and, army power. And then the Red Aja are again antagonists to Rand as they throw him in a box and kind of carry him away, putting the Aes Sedai and Black Aja somewhere in our hierarchy, but it's confusing. A Crown of Swords. As I mentioned before, although Elida is mostly gray in her evil, her second in command is a Black Aja, which makes the whole White Tower kind of fit into this tangential thing as mentioned earlier. Podon Fane is back with his Mist. He once again demonstrates why he is a top-tier Dark Friend and probably somewhere near the top of the ranking below the Forsaken, just for how he stands in the way of everyone. Shaidar Haran pops up in this book and serves as the big dog in the ranks of the Murdrawl. We've seen him a couple of times before, and we'll see him again. I believe in this book, well, in Abu Dar, we see a Golem, which is, you know, indestructibly wise, near the very top of the list. It was made by the Forsaken and largely can't be defeated. It's very hard to defeat. It's probably highest up before Dark Friends and Forsaken in terms of just the foot soldiers. We get, of course, Shamael at Shadar Logoth. This is the end for Shamael, but we also get to see who is essentially our top tier villain again, Moradin, come back. Moradin and Shamael are the same, sitting essentially where the Dark One sits on our hierarchy. Finally, the Shan-Chan arrive again as the big tangential villain, giving a full invasion force. The Path of Daggers. This book is largely just the Shido and the Shan-Chan, and it's the same for the others going forward for a little bit. Rand is also kind of a villain in this book when using Kalendor, which makes him, again, very interesting. Winter's Heart. The Borderlanders are kind of fake antagonists, so you could put them in the fake hierarchy. But the same with this book as the last one, it is the Shido and the Shan-Chan all the way through. Podon Fane is back again, and again moves up a little bit. But really all that happens in this book is a big fight at the end and the cleansing of Sayadine. Crossroads of Twilight, Shan-Chan, Shido. Seriously though, nothing happens in this book. Knife of Dreams, the Forsaken pop up again, begin discussing the seals. Most of the seals are broken. We see the battle on the horizon, really giving us an idea of the top tier being the Dark One. Semirage shows up in this book and is actually quite a force to be reckoned with. There's a lot of Dark Friends, shadowy creatures we've already seen. Shan-Chan come after Tuon, and they're still very much tangential villains. But it's very much the politics. Taim really sucks. Woohoo. Gathering Storm, Shan-Chan, Trollocs begin to fight, which just kind of confuses our lists even more. Semirage moves up again by attacking Min through Rand. And Rand also uses the True Source, which kind of represents why he might fit into our tangential ranking somewhere. Shan-Chan immediately undo any good by attacking the White Tower and taking Domani. Rand then finally escapes the villain cycle as he manages to merge with Luz Theron. Towers of Midnight, Podon Fane is back again. Slayer comes back and is still pretty dumb. Masana is killed. A lot of other stuff happens. A Memory of Light. Here's the ending here. This is where we get our biggest example of the Dark One in what is probably one of the best parts of the series, the kind of philosophical debate at the end. Taim shows up one last time to be a very pretty much top tier villain of the series in a very last inning fashion. Lanfear is still very strange. Moradin is back. Demadrag is a bad boy. Grendel worships Aviendo like we all do and then dies. Lanfear dead. Podon Fane dead. And finally we get the confrontation with the Dark One as aforementioned. Also, Moradin dead. Anyway, the Wheel of Time definitely has my favorite of all the hierarchies, but it becomes, as you can notice, incredibly confusing. So I think it's time we look at what if we took that and maybe streamlined it a little bit. Bone is a fairly simple story compared to Wheel of Time, and its hierarchy certainly gets a lot less complicated. Sometime soon I'd like to just go through this and all the books within and talk about them. But today I'm just going to focus on the hierarchies with a little bit of spoilers, so do be careful. The foot troops of Bone are very much the rat creatures or the hairy men. They are the orc equivalent, although they're much dumber and sillier than the orcs are. And then on top of the rat creatures here, we have their chieftain being King Doc. King Doc is a lot like the orc chiefs that we see in Lord of the Rings. Now, King Doc himself takes orders from the stick eater known as the Hooded One, who we later find out is Briar, which makes her relation to the heroes a lot more complicated and an overall more interesting Tier 3 villain here. Finally, Briar is taking orders from the Lord of Locusts, and you could fit Mim in there if you consider them different characters, but Lord of Locusts is the big bad of the world, being the spirit entity from the Dreaming. Now, Bone also has some of the best tangential villains of all time. It has an incredibly simple normal hierarchy, but we move over to tangential and we see Rokja and Terrell. Now, Rokja mostly sides with evil, but for the purposes of the 5th book is to demonstrate he is on both sides. He just thinks you must pick a side, and really he's just in it for the profit and power, which is the story of Master of the Eastern Border. Then there's Terrell. He is obviously more on the side of light than the others, but because he did usurp Athenia, and is very much against the dragons, he kind of stops protecting people from the locusts, meaning he stands in the way of our heroes. And that's the hierarchy of Bone. It's much more simple. We have a lot less characters to follow, but it does this perfectly where each chapter introduces a stack upon the others, which makes it incredibly interesting. And that is how hierarchies of evil work in fantasy. If you have other examples, I would love to hear them. I find this idea incredibly interesting. I use it in D&D campaigns a lot, and I think it's just a good way to write fantasy villains. It's certainly an easy way to do it. And it all kind of goes back to Lord of the Rings. But you see this in Narnia too. You see this in a lot of other series. But I hope you learned something. Have a great day.